Welcome to Regulatory Ramblings. Our guest today is Bénédicte Nolens. She's had a varied career as a lawyer, a compliance head at a financial institution, as well as having served as a regulator, given her close to 6-year stint at Hong Kong's Markets Watchdog Securities and Futures Commission. She's currently the head of the Bank of International Settlements Innovation Hub here in Hong Kong. And like some people in compliance circles, she saw early on the importance of fintech and regtech and the role that virtual assets would play in our lives. It's in that vein that she talks to us today about the BIS's successful completion of the CBDC pilot scheme that the BIS spearheaded, which involved Hong Kong, the governments of Hong Kong, the People's Republic of China, the United Arab Emirates, and Thailand. Bénédicte Nolens, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Much appreciated. So mBridge seeks to promote multi-currency cross-border payments, and the scheme recently completed its 1-month trial. So congratulations on that. So what do you, from a legal and compliance perspective, what should people know about such a new and seemingly complex process, at least on the outset?
Yeah, so I would maybe distinguish between policy, legal, and compliance. So starting maybe with policy. Actually, policy is probably the most difficult aspect here because it is about providing access to your currency to banks that are not in your jurisdiction. So that is actually a key policy evolution that needs to take place. In this trial that we did, so in this pilot, actually the central banks agreed that was okay, that the banks in other jurisdictions could have access to the currency in the form of, in this digital form called CBDC. But again, if you think about that on a global scale, that is a very important policy question. Another policy question still, and straddling over to legal is data, is where does the data sit and who has the data. So in a basic setting, you could centralize everything, right? But then this international cross-border data is centralized, which is probably not ideal. So as part of having worked on this project for now over a year, we're thinking maybe that this is, you could nearly say, an ideal use case for distributed ledgers, because you can actually distribute the information. Then you get to the next questions around where the cloud sits. So this pilot was done on a centralized cloud in Hong Kong, actually high security cloud. But again, we're thinking about further decentralizing that so that the different central banks can choose to have their own cloud instance where they run their nodes and where their information for their transfers on this infrastructure actually sits. So data is probably an area we need to spend even more time on than we already did. It's very privacy protected already, but we probably need more of that decentralization to meet the national expectations and requirements.
It's also a very touchy topic given jurisdictions have their own rules.
So many jurisdictions now have data localization requirements. Look, in that sense, though, this sample of 4 jurisdictions is a very good one because you know that China has very, very solid rules on this. Another policy-related matter is always about access to your currency in general, because several of these countries do not have free-flowing currencies. So again, it's a good sample because we don't have open markets for each of these 4 jurisdictions. For Hong Kong,
China
obviously,
on one
yes.
end, Dubai, UAE, and Hong Kong, and then Thailand.
Correct. Correct. Exactly. So another purely legal thing we need to figure out, and that's basic, but also not that easy to do, doable, but we need to work on it, is simply the contracts for access to the platform and the TNCs. So this is not a minor issue because you need
e-contracts for e-currencies?
No, you need to really come up with the terms and conditions, right? Which means you need to decide for example, which law governs in case of dispute, right? You need to think about liability-related matters and clauses. Exactly. So that's where for the purpose of the students, that's where really you hit into needing to draft some detailed contracts. So for this trial, we had basic TNCs and basic access contracts, but it's probably needing to be upgraded if this needs to go to MVP or if it needs to reach a production stage. And then broader legal matters always around governance, right? So you need a governance over this. Who's going to govern it? Is it a completely decentralized process? Is it a decentralized process with a centralized organization? Then who's going to be the governance of that organization? Is that membership based? You know, all these questions are still out there, and intrinsically also linked to legal, because you need to decide on how you want to govern it to then decide what legal setup you will have around it. And then on the compliance end, to be frank, it continues always, we always keep on running into the same issues that every bank runs into, which is who does the AML, the CTF, the sanctions compliance. This is like, you could think, could a platform do it? But it maybe makes no practical sense for the platform to do it, in which case you do need to rely on the banks to continue doing it. So if you look at the report we issued yesterday, we did, or 2 days ago, we did say in it that we expect the banks to continue playing that role, so that the platform would not take over this role. And that is in line with how it's done for other organizations as well. So for SWIFT, for example, it's the banks that need to perform all these different roles. So that's, I think, the principle. Other than maybe broader issues that come with governance, I think the AML question is an important one, because it is an area where theoretically you could think you can create a lot of efficiencies if it could be done centrally, but then practically you may not want to do it centrally.
Well, that was,
and it hits into privacy, by the way, because if you do it centrally, then the only way to do it centrally is if you don't have the privacy. Exactly. Right.
Yeah. Because looking, I know that I gave it a cursory look last night in your report. AML was a key issue to consider, and I appreciate that, because that's the background I come from, so I could really sink my teeth into that. And yeah, the presumption was, when I first heard the announcement of the trial completion, was the platform would probably handle AML and KYC, but clearly it is a new age, but the banks can't shirk their responsibility. They've still got a lot of work to do.
Look, I think the issue is that there is a very standing reliance, actually, of the central banks on the banks to do this role. And it comes up in every CBDC project now. And what I see is the inclination is to say, well, look, that role has to stay with the private sector. Yeah. And again, AML and privacy are always a bit of a tug of war, right? So if you need to do, if theoretically even the platform needs to do it, then you would need to have a lot of centralized, transparent information, which is not what these different jurisdictions would want, because it's a cross-border situation. So the difficulties even rise more in cross-border for two reasons, because you have national rules and regulations, right? And also simply because in a cross-border context, you may have other policy expectations of those regulators that need to be complied with.
It strikes me that from having in my years of covering this, that when you talk to bankers, you talk to regulators, that this is a problem as old as AML compliance, that in a globalized era, with banks operating in multiple jurisdictions, serving the same clients in multiple jurisdictions, information needs to be able to cross borders. But then you have the turf wars between different jurisdictions with their own rules. And so that impedes effective KYC. And so that, you know, that struggle's not going anywhere.
Yeah, the other issue is a lot of people keep on talking about digital identity, right? But again, to the extent I know of digital identity, it's only limited to individuals so far in the digital in a more efficient format. And then it's largely contingent normally on national systems.
Yeah,
again.
jurisdiction specific.
Yeah, so my info or I am smart. These are examples of that. And even then, it's a touchy thing, right? Whether people want that centralization of their identity. So, there's still places on Earth, pretty prominent places, that don't have identity systems for that very privacy-related reason. So, and then, but actually, in banking, most of these transactions are by corporates, and there the problem is even much bigger, because they normally have global setups. They're never just one layer. They're normally 5, 6 layers, or they're global companies with many different entities in different jurisdictions. And that unraveling process, which is done as part of AML compliance roles in these banks, that is like there is no real solution to automating that so far. We actually did write a report on this for anybody who's interested, and we called it Corporate Identity, no silver bullet, but a silver lining, meaning that we couldn't see a silver bullet solution. We could see a silver lining. The silver lining is that many jurisdictions are thinking about it. Singapore, in fact, has already improved the automation of the corporate registry, but it's literally an exception on the planet. And if you think about corporate setups, as said, they're normally in so many different jurisdictions. Most of them have done no effort to automate these corporate registries. So until you fix this issue, which you see is very complex because it's national times 2, individual and corporate solutions need to be come up with on national levels. And then you do that times X number of countries, you can see that's going to take a really long time. So in the end, you probably end up with a situation where banks do need to continue playing that role. Banks and licensed entities, right? Because PSPs also have to comply with AML rules. Yeah.
AMLO. Certainly, it seems to me that organization-wide compliance across borders remains an aspirational goal, but the integrity. Many nation states are concerned about national sovereignty and their integrity, and so that's going to continue to be an impediment, so it seems. So you brought up Singapore, and people are wondering, why isn't Singapore part of the mBridge group? That really would have cinched it. That if Singapore was on board, maybe you could have got more other Asian countries on board. Because you have the 2 major financial centers then.
Yeah, so we actually, I don't know whether you saw, but in the report we disclosed the 9 observing jurisdictions. So we do have a lot of Asian jurisdictions actually already acting as observers, notwithstanding that Singapore is not yet involved. So there is no real reason why Singapore is not involved, other than that the BIS has these centers in Hong Kong and Singapore, and last year Singapore was very focused on a very similar cross-border CBDC project. But at current, it seems to be more focused on another project, which is on connecting faster payment systems, which is another solution to the same issue of cross-border payment. So in some, all jurisdictions are welcome to join this project. We have 9 observers already, and they're disclosed in the report. And Howard Lee, when just announced, his quote says, more jurisdictions would be welcome to come and either join as a pilot participant in the future, in future pilots, or at the minimum as observers. So we would welcome any jurisdictions is the answer.
The other thing is that you got the UAE, which got a lot of people interested. Do you envisage other countries in APAC or the Middle East joining? I mean, and what people I've spoken to really seem to be interested in is, could this be a bridge between Greater China and the larger Middle East in terms of fostering more trade, more exchange, more transactions? Dubai's got all kinds of things going on with, the UAE and VARA, the first virtual asset regulatory authority.
Sure. I think, to be frank, it's not exactly connected to the topic, though, of virtual assets, in the sense that this is about speeding up international payments, because the key use case for mBridge is really to speed up global payments. So through doing it with this new technology that DLT ultimately is, that's really the use case. So I would say it's not necessarily about NFTs. So it's more like any payment processes, and we're trying to speed them up. That's what it is. But you're right, it could encourage trade in general between the UAE and any of the participants, including, of course, China. Yeah.
So what do you think of the receptivity of CBDCs and this scheme in the Hong Kong market? I mean, how receptive, how open do you think people are to it?
Yeah, so we classify this as wholesale CBDC, and the trend that is out there right now is that most hubs like ourselves in Singapore and the US, for example, they are looking for the international aspect. So if you say hub, you say international, you say cross-border. People are only looking at the wholesale CBDC use case. So in sum, that means it's not so much about reception by retail, right? Because retail is not relevant to that. It's about reception by the wholesale participants, which are the banks. That's the key question, really, for wholesale infrastructures. For retail, I think it's a completely different ballgame. We do have a project on that as well in Hong Kong. In fact, we just released a report on that called Aurum, and that's also really, really interesting for people who are interested in at least computer science aspects of this. So that also proposes an intermediated structure where consequently all the private information remains with the banks as opposed to with the central bank. But it also has a second structure to it, which is a stablecoin structure, which is similar to the current note issuing bank model of the banks in Hong Kong. So the notes that we have in Hong Kong are actually issued by the three note issuing banks. So we could replicate that in a digital format, and the replication then takes the form actually of a stable coin, right? Where the bank issues that stable coin, and it's backed with assets held in the wholesale system as a reserve with the HKMA.
With each unit of digital currency having its own individualized serial number.
Correct, yeah, exactly. Yeah. And we used, for that prototype, in fact, it uses the same mechanism as Bitcoin uses, which is the UTXO mechanism, the on-spent transaction output mechanism, which means you can actually track the spending of that token through the chain of UTXOs.
Yeah, it's a very different world. There's I don't know. There seems to be a lot of skittishness around CBDCs. I mean, as you said, right now this is going to be a wholesale game.
Yeah. So for mBridge is completely wholesale. So it's about the ultimate quest is, can it significantly improve the speed and efficiency of international trade?
And will it lower costs?
Yeah. And if it can, then there is a use case, right?
Yeah. In terms of, I mean, you're open to other countries joining. Could you see more joining perhaps by the end of the year, the next 18 months, 2 years?
Probably,
amongst your observers.
Yeah. So right now, in terms of observers, I don't want to miss any, but we do have Malaysia, we have Indonesia, we have Korea. We have also Riksbank, even in the Nordics, because they're quite advanced on CBDC experimentation. We have the European Center of the BIS, and we also have actually the FED Center. That is the alliance that we have with the FED innovation side. And which ones am I missing now? There's probably some. Vietnam recently joined. So we do have quite a variety of jurisdictions. We will see, though, which ones want to pilot participation, because ultimately what we definitely learned ourselves this year is you learn a lot more when you do pilot participation, because that's when you get your banks at the table, and the banks are ultimately also parties that can critique it, and that's how you can improve, right? So without bringing your ecosystem to the table and just observing it, actually is more like a studying exercise. Whereas if you do the pilot, you get your hands dirty really, and I think it is a better form of participation.
Certainly.
And by the way, the other four are really developing the system. So they're on a completely other level, right? Because they are doing the hands-on development. But we are offering to other jurisdictions to either be an observer for sure if you want, but we think it's better to do a pilot participation. And so we're expecting to do another pilot maybe in the same time frame next year. Yeah.
So if we were to tease out the BIS's role, I mean, in terms of in all this, is it setting norms? Is it providing technical assistance and guidance, or all the above?
So I'm the head of the steering committee, which means that I chair the steering committee across 4 different jurisdictions. And these jurisdictions have different focus areas, but in general, so far it's been very fluid. So let's say there is a committee for policy, because that's what I said. Policy is actually a very critical aspect here, right? Because if you can't comply with the policy expectations of different markets, there is an issue. Secondly, business use cases. We looked at use cases last year and published a short report which had many use cases, but we really thought we have to focus for now on the most obvious, which is just speed up trade, right? And reduce the costs, increase the efficiency. That's the biggest use case currently existent. That doesn't mean that there isn't future use cases like settling of tokenized securities could be done, right? But in the current environment, what is happening every day is trade, so we're focused on trade. And then we have a committee for the technology development, obviously, which continues trying to take in all these user expectations and then translate that into code, really. And the last committee is the legal committee, actually, focused on contracts and T&Cs, for example.
As far as involvement of the local regulator, the HKMA, I take you confer with them as well. What's been their response?
Yeah, so the HKMA is chairing the legal committee.
Right.
Yeah, and then Thailand is chairing the policy committee, and the UAE is chairing the business committee, and DCI is chairing the technology committee.
Okay.
Yeah, which in practice really means they're taking a lead on each of these different topics. So that's how it works.
In terms of their own sliver of the puzzle, their own, what they feel competent at.
Are actually more needs-based, I think. So because you could say legal is, a lot of people might try to avoid the legal space, actually. But in this case, someone needs to pick up the legal side. So it's by needs that everybody, we thought these are the key core things we need to figure out: legal, technology, policy, and the use case, the business case, right? So that's why different leads have different responsibilities, but I would say it's very fluid because everybody comments on everybody pretty much all the time. It's been a very collaborative process.
I can see why someone might want to shirk or shy away from taking on legal, because you're breaking new ground.
Yeah.
A lot of unanswered questions.
Yeah.
So when it's something that's untested, it's on your first impression, that's where you learn, but obviously and advances get made. But for those that have to break that new ground, it's a challenge.
Yeah, although I would say the inverse as well is that the nice thing about the law is it's actually pretty set. So, which means that...
But you have to creatively apply it to new settings.
Exactly. But it's not like you're like rudderless, right? You know exactly what your anchor is, and then you need to work around that anchor. Yeah.
Yeah.
So on this one, I think you might have seen, but KWM provided advice on this. So maybe to add, because you do have an anchor, you also have law firms, right? So you have people you can actually go to and say, okay, help me with this, because we can't invent it ourselves, right? And actually that's another aspect about legal. You see, you always go for professional advice. It's not something you make up along the path, right? You probably know, for example, you need a contract, you need T&Cs, you need to figure these things out. But exactly the writing of it, you're going to seek legal advice. So in some it's difficult, but it's also doable. Yeah. Actually, to go back to our earlier discussion, the AML thing is the more troubling one, because that's where you go like, can you really materially change things? And maybe not. Maybe we're really set in a situation where the intermediaries have to continue playing that role.
I'd like to talk more about your time at the SFC. I mean, you spent close to 6 years there, first as director and head of strategy and risk, and then as director and head of their fintech unit, and you like many people are not a techie, but you learned about it on the job. So I mean that must have been challenging. I mean, certainly in terms of the learning curve, but also what was your tipping point? What caused you to wake up and say, fintech, regtech, crypto, virtual assets, this is the wave of the future. This is something I need to learn about, because this is it's no longer a black letter law or mechanical finance world. The things have moved on from there. So what opened your eyes, should we say?
Yeah, so first of all, you're right. Most of my past until that point was actually in risk and compliance and law. So you would say the more risk spotting side of things as opposed to the opportunity spotting side of things, right? But I do think, let's say I do spot new things very easily, maybe too easily. That's one of the problems.
So where to benefit, right? I mean, you're ahead of the curve.
Well, look, I mean, I'm here in Hong Kong as well. I came here 25 years ago, right? A lot of people were moving the other way. It was 1997. So let's say new things never scared me. So that's why what did I see? I saw so much new stuff going on that I went like, this is going to be fundamentally transformative to finance, but not just fundamentally transformative. You could say even a fundamental threat from a competitive standpoint to how finance was done up until that moment. So I actually did issue that in a report, and it's still available online. It was a report written on behalf of IOSCO, the International Organization of Securities Commissions, about...
This was in, what, 2017?
Something like that, yeah.
Was
16
it
or 17.
May of 2017?
I forgot.
Vaguely,
but anyway, that report, there is a key chart there in the introductory section where it shows the unbundling of banking. And the reason I point this out today is because McKinsey just actually released a report in the last 2 days saying this is now getting really progressed. And that's in some... What did I see? That's what I saw. So what did I see? I saw robo-advisors, I saw crowdfunding, I saw Bitcoin. There wasn't the ICOs yet, but then in the summer of 2017, that exploded. And where we've gone since. So I saw all of these things and I went like, it's very clear that all these solutions are going to try and democratize the access to finance, because that's really what they were doing. They were doing, robo-advice was a democratization of investment, because until then you could say the great algorithms were reserved to the investment bank trading desks. And no individual had access to them. You had to rely on these intermediaries. But think about you and me. I'm sure you went through the same journey, trying to pick a fund that would outperform. It was impossible. It was just a matter of luck, or maybe just looking at the track record. You never had an access to an algo. Well, what robo-advisors really did is change that, right? So you can put small amounts of money, you don't even need the size of a typical fund investment, and you can put it to work with an algorithm. That was the first generation of robo-advisors. At the same time, you had crowdfunding coming around, and what was that? That was literally, startups needing money and not getting it from the banking system. So people came up with crowdfunding. In tandem, there was peer-to-peer lending. It was just another way of getting access to finance when you couldn't have access in the banking system. And then came Bitcoin. And what Bitcoin, actually it was already there, but it started, Ether just came around. And it was becoming amply clear that people thought, one thing is they thought they could democratize the currency, B, or make it, I shouldn't say they're democratized, but make it more peer-to-peer settlement driven. That's really the base thesis there. And for Ether, the whole idea was to create further peer-to-peer ecosystems. So you see what I'm saying? All of this actually is one theme. And I thought it would be highly transformative.
But it touches multiple things. It touches the great unbanked.
Every
it
aspect
touches
of finance.
cheaper ways to send remittances.
Yes. So it touches every aspect of finance. And that's what we set out in that report. So if you ask me, that report embodies what I thought, is that this is going to be incredibly transformative. It also had the last chapter, by the way, on blockchain. It was very early stages, but it touches on all of this. It touches even on CBDC. I think that a central bank version of money would be needed in such circumstance for regulated markets. So if you look at it back, we're now, 6 years later, something like it. And we're very progressed in this evolution in some ways. Like, for example, what crypto trading platforms did is take that robo-advice idea like a lot further, because now you can even choose on these platforms which algo you're going to use. Whereas in the robo-advisor, you're actually choosing their algo, right? But it allowed you to come in with much less money. I still remember Acorns was one. You could come with very small amounts. That didn't work before. You couldn't go somewhere and say, I want to invest just a very tiny amount in a diversified portfolio. Other than we did have ETFs, and they're, by the way, still a great product. I covered those in a prior report as well. They're also a form of I think, democratizing investment. But now on crypto platforms, as I said, you can even choose the algorithm you want to trade with, which is pretty significant. Now, of course, I know there are consumer protection questions, right, which I'm not making abstraction of. But the reality is I just looked at all of this and I went like, these are all functionalities that I could previously only get by either being a high net worth customer or by being a bank myself. Right? And that's all being given to the general public. That for sure raises consumer protection issues, but it also ups the choice of participants. And I think, if anything, that's the current dilemma of securities regulators now, right? That's a difficult dilemma because you want to give people actually the choice, but at the same time, do they really understand all these difficult things? And you could also turn it around another way around, which is that if you don't give them that choice, they'll never learn it either.
This is true, yeah, in terms of raising the sophistication of the overall investing public. A cynic would say, though, most people are just chasing alpha, and that it's only when things turn against them, market-wise, that they will allege unauthorized trading, unauthorized transactions, churning. That we saw this with Lehman, that people didn't care too much about the niceties, the fine point detail in the footnotes, so long as they were doing well. But just because these offerings are available now doesn't necessarily mean they have the sophistication to use them. I think more needs to be done on the part of their own education. I think the SFC enables people to a great extent to educate themselves. But as we saw even with Lehman, that there's a difference between financial wealth and financial sophistication are not necessarily synonymous.
Yes, exactly. And I would say in the Lehman environment, because I was still in traditional banking at the time with pretty much private wealth accounts, and it was the same, they were all doing these leveraged products, and when they turned against them, suddenly they didn't understand the product. So to be frank, I think this is not limited to retail. It's, as you say, it's a common thing of humans to want to try some new thing, try to make money, but then when they lose money, they go like, where is the basis on which I can claim it back? That's where the lawyers come in handy then. But
Lawyers do come in handy. I'll tell you why. You have an MBA from the University of Chicago. I know people that graduated from the Booth School of Business of your alma mater, and they were duped. And it took Siren Johnstone, our securities regulation prof here in HKU, to diagram it out for me, to show me that these were not really bonds. These were notes with a variable annuity stream paying into the note, and that's what generated the returns. And that had most people seen that, I don't know if they would have questioned more, or if they would have been more reluctant, or if it would have given them pause before they invested. But that level of understanding does not typically exist in most investment materials. That simplification, that diagrammatic description. But of course, this is ex post facto. This is after the fact when we do the post-mortem.
Exactly. But I said what has so fundamentally changed since is the onset of all these new financial offerings on the internet, right? And I said that's what I saw come. I think it offers great opportunity, but of course it doesn't come without risk. So there is a need to control the risk, and I do think a knowledge and experience is critical, right? So are doing additional courses. If you want to do certain things, then maybe there needs to be some kind of knowledge and experience expectation, including having attended classes that make you understand these type of products.
And to that end, I would say, to plug HKU's FinTech certificate, which is 3 modules. It's relatively inexpensive, and I think it gives people, certainly people like myself who are non-techies, a good grounding in the subject matter. Because as I discussed with an earlier guest, too many of the programs I see out there assume a basic comprehension, a baseline knowledge of computer science, computer programming. Yeah. Too many programs, fintech programs out there are terrific, but when you examine the curricula, it's designed for techies. And that's not the average person. That's not your typical Mrs. Chan, Joe Q public. If I could go further back in time, though, I mean, before you became a regulator, before you were an associate at the law firm, I mean, what drew you to the legal profession? What was, as opposed to just going straight into financial services, what drew you to the legal profession?
Yeah, so my father was actually a law degree holder, so I always saw, let's say, the law. I don't know. I just decided to do it, and as I started doing it, I've always seen the use of it. And as I mentioned in the prior conversation just now, right? The nice thing about lawyers, and it's really not to be underestimated, is that it is a profession that you can only exercise with a certificate, right? A bar admission in some. That is very different from business. I can do business without any certification of any sort. So why is that good? That means that if you hold that certification, you should have a useful role in society. Now, you may not become Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates, right? You may not become them because probably when you chose the law, you're too risk averse to be one of them in the first place, right? But I think that there is a beauty to those few professions that are left that actually require certification. So in that sense, I see law very similar to, for example, the medical profession. right?
It
You
is one of the
need
three
a
traditional
certification.
professions, yeah, along
Yes,
with accounting.
and you need ongoing education. The other thing about the law is that one thing I didn't do, so maybe that's where I deviated. It requires actually specialization. To be a top lawyer, if that's what you go for, a top partner in a law firm, you need to specialize. And you need to continue that specialization, that ongoing learning in that specialization. So my career, but this was a decision made very early in my career when I moved into in-house. When you move in-house, you become more generalist and versatile. Sure. So in some, the same qualification is still the same use, but it's a different path you're choosing. One path, you're deepening down on one vertical with that law degree, and in the other, you stay very horizontal with that law degree. But so, for example, in my current role, I need to sign vendor contracts, for example, all the time, and it proves we didn't even have decent templates for that. So, or we had templates, but they weren't going to work in the specific circumstances that we needed to look for. So it's been very useful to have my law degree because I can push this stuff through much faster than my equivalents in other centers who don't have the same law degrees.
Oh, and I can say that for legal journalism as well. That
Yeah.
it's, not to brag, but it's easier for me than for someone who's not versed in the law to write about the law, as having both the journalism training and the legal education, because I frequently see things like, well, certainly in the common law tradition, we talk about people being alive having heirs apparent. The term heir is thrown around, routinely in the colloquial vernacular. Mainstream business and legal journalists confuse insolvency and bankruptcy, and certainly the former can lead to the latter, but they're not the same. Little things like that.
Like little things here and there, but what I notice more fundamentally even is that people who don't have a law degree, they won't dare touching that contract. And for me, it's those kind of contracts are really basic in my view, so they're really easy for me. So I don't know, I think it's a barrier that people self-impose, honestly. Maybe the same way as for computer science. You said, I'm not a technologist, right? And you've a self-imposed barrier there on computer science, right? So in some, I think with law it's incredibly useful, as said, for any parts of your life, later corporate governance, setting up companies, and doing any contracts, which you need in any business anyway. But to go for a second though to computer science, which you asked, like I'm doing tech, I'm not a techie, right? It's true. But two things. So when I did my MBA, we were having I think it was our statistics class or something like it. And statistics requires an enormous amount of logical thinking. I thought I would completely like statistics. I thought I'd fail the thing, right? But the professor said, okay, who are the lawyers here? And there was 3 of us in the room. And he said, okay, one of you is going to have the top grades. And it was really amazing to me. And then I started going like, okay, I thought statistics is math, which I thought maybe not within scope. But anyway, the very fact that you have a logical thinking mindset can get you really, really far in many aspects, including something as complicated, as seemingly complicated as statistics. So that's what I learned from that. The same actually goes for tech. I think, I'm not a coder, but coding is actually really logical. So it's something that if I wanted to learn, I'm sure I could learn it. I just think it's a bit late in my career, right? But here comes my last point.
In terms of the commitment of time and...
Yeah, well, here comes my last point. I think really one of my sons, for example, seems to be inclined towards computer science. Another one seems to be inclined towards the law. I think, to be frank, it needs to be both in the future. So I think if you want to be super successful or super special lawyer, you do a computer science degree on top of it, like you do the 2. And I think that's going to be, and that's where, let's say virtual assets, that's where you will be really able to advise beyond TNCs, but on how the smart contract is really drafted, for example. So So I really think if I started again, if I was 20, which I'm clearly not, that I would think that right away now. So I would think like I need to combine both. And maybe to say it more broadly, I think understanding coding is becoming nearly a basic language one has to be able to speak. And I would caution, though, that I've learned as part of playing my half tech roles now, that coding languages are like languages. So they keep on evolving and new languages keep on coming out. So for being a top coder, honestly, you need an enormous amount of dedication. It's like that lawyer that does a complete vertical specialization, right? So, but I think understanding the basics of coding, not being scared of it, understanding if you want to be a DLT lawyer, understanding the basics of how blockchains work and are coded with which principles of coding, I think is really useful.
So many things pop into my mind when I hear you say that, because we, in an early episode of Regulatory Ramblings, we had Ron Yu. Ron Yu is an adjunct professor of IP and internet law at HKU and a few other schools around town. His focus is patent law. He's one of these rare people in that he's worked at IBM as an engineer, and he's worked on both the software and the hardware side before he went into law. So I asked him, will the lawyer of the future need to know coding? He said, no, you don't need to be a coder, but you need to be a power user. You need to understand functionality. You need to understand what this can be used for, these applications. But it sounds like what you're saying is you'll need to go further than that.
I think if you learn the coding, then all the rest follows with it. Whereas if you only learn the principles and not the coding, it's the same as learning the principles of a language. It's different from speaking that exact language. So I think at least basic coding classes are really, really recommendable, is my own view. And then a deep dive into, let's say for blockchain specifically, I'm starting to feel is actually really, really specific in its coding approach, or in exactly which computer science lingo you need to be able to use. So I think before we were mostly dealing in some with centralized information management systems. That's what we were dealing with. And there, I don't think as a lawyer you needed to know so much of this. But if it's about smart contracts, I do think you need ideally you've done the law and the coding around it, so that you can, ideally that makes you a rare case, as you said. Right? If you want to be a rare unicorn, then you have to maybe do these two.
And he certainly adds value. But again, I saw this when I was studying law. I mean, I could never go into patents because I came from a liberal arts background. I could do soft IP, I could do copyrights, I could do trademarks, e-commerce, and indeed that was the focus of my master's degree in IP. But for those that wanted to make the effort, during law school I noticed some of them going back to night school to get the bachelor's degree in computer science or chemistry or what have you.
Yeah.
So that they could take the patent bar. And at that time, late 90s, early 2000s, patent lawyers were minting money. That was when the recession struck. But yeah, they were doing very well for themselves. But most lawyers don't come with that background. Going back to the crypto space, it is its own language. Now, I recently got back from Dubai, attending 3 weeks of fintech and crypto events. A lot of it was over my head. Some of it was technical, so that's understandable. A lot of it was abstract and grandiose in terms of the great projections, prognostications of what Bitcoin and blockchain and DLT and DeFi and NFTs would mean for mankind. A lot of that, but it was interesting, and of course, in my journalistic days, I would say, okay, so what's the legal angle? What's the compliance angle that I can hang my hat on and lead with? Because that was oftentimes unclear. But to come back to your point about it's the legal profession is one of these three professions where you've got to have a certificate to practice.
Yeah, so for all the non-computer science related parts of law, because maybe I should say if you want to do tech and law, you better do the two, is what I'm saying. Of course, if you want to just be, let's say, a trial lawyer or something like that, you don't need to spend your time on this, right? So it depends on if your affinity is towards the tech side of things, I think it's best to do both. But for everything else, as said, you still need that legal certificate to be able to practice.
And litigation support is heavily tech oriented, right? With forensics and going data searching service. I'm not sure if that's the right term, but the kind of thing that the big four do, the Kroll.
Yeah.
I forget their name. You've got Hill and Associates. You've got Kroll. Productivity, Navigant, firms of that nature. But I'm sorry, FTI was the one I was thinking of. The thing about having a certificate is, okay, it sets a minimum floor, it sets minimum standards. Certainly, when it came to the bar exam, that's a monumental achievement. I mean, you taking the New York bar exam, something I still need to do, but that is a monumental achievement.
Yeah, it wasn't pleasant at the time. We still had to sit at these little desks.
Well, 3 years of law school, 3 years of work compressed into 2 days. That's in California's 3 days.
That's scary.
Yeah, because they've got more essays.
I think you only can do these things I think, at least for me, when you're young, because you're not scared of it. But right now, when I think back and I go, I remember the size of that room and the tiny size of the desk, and we were all just a number having to write. Oh my God, that was a little bit scary.
Actually, I think I'm more ready for it now.
Really?
At 45, I'm more ready for it now than I was then. Because
Really?
I was burnt out at the end of college.
I'm a little bit more
starting to study law at the age of 21, 22, graduating before I hit 25. I mean, I wasn't ready for it then. And I found the older students tend to do better because they didn't freak out, one, about every deadline, and two, they had things that they could relate it to. So a guy who was a former doctor, he got screwed, felt the system was against him, went to law school hoping to change the system. He'd been exposed to law in his own realm. The people in insurance companies, they've been exposed to law doing what they do. Same with the investment bankers. A certificate sets minimum standards. But I've also seen the darker side of it, and that my late advisor, Marcus Hearn, used to say that too many lawyers think that once they get their card, once they get their bar license, not just the cynical, I've got a license to steal, but the attitude of, okay, now that I'm a lawyer, society will continue to pay me an easy living, and all I have to do is show up. I'm a member of the bar. I can sign off on things. I can sprinkle a few Latin and French terms and a little bit of legal jargon, and yesterday's forms will hereafter entitle me to an easy living. And frankly, having grown up in Hong Kong, there was a time when I saw lawyers of that nature in this town as well. But I mean, those people don't really add value. They're parasites on society. They engage in rent-seeking activity, rent-seeking business, as opposed to the modern lawyer, which even I saw in the 90s, was you had to know a little something about business. You had to know a little something about finance. You had to be able to know how to read a basic series of accounting statements.
Yeah.
And that's a heavily underutilized course, accounting for lawyers.
I agree, which is why I did a business degree as well, right? I do think it's very critical to understand, well, at least again, if you're going for that intersection with finance, you've got to understand finance. Yeah. And for in general, I think accounting knowledge is one of those fundamental fundamentals that you nearly need to survive throughout the rest of your career. So for example, I just did do one of the courses, which was the FD board directors course.
I saw that advertised. How was that?
Yeah, so I did that one, and had to go back to learning accounting again, right? So it's important.
And you went to Chicago, which is known for being heavily quantitative.
Very quantitative.
I mean, it's. I know there's this debate back and forth between Chicago and Northwestern because Chicago says that they do real business, real finance, whereas Northwestern's international business and marketing. But you've got great marketing profs at Chicago. You've got great finance profs at Northwestern, Kellogg. So. But that perception still, to a great extent, I think holds good because I think the philosophy at Booth was if you want to assess a problem, you got to look at what the numbers say.
Yeah, and to be frank, when I decided to do my MBA, I didn't want an MBA that was very light on numbers. I specifically chose an MBA that was really heavy on numbers, and the reason was because I wanted to combine it with finance. I was already in Goldman Sachs. In fact, Goldman Sachs is the one who gave me the scholarship to do that MBA. So, for me, it's a no-brainer. If I'm a lawyer and I'm trying to do an MBA, I'm doing it not for that certificate. I'm doing it to learn about the numbers. And I completely, in all my life, I think numbers speak, that you can even look in the news today. Just look for numbers. Don't look for too much of he says, she says. Look for what the numbers say. GDP numbers, employment numbers, unemployment numbers, they're all numbers, right? And the same goes for business, of course. Share prices are numbers, market cap are numbers, so sales are numbers. Yeah. Numbers are everywhere. I actually, honestly, I do like numbers. So maybe I'm an unusual lawyer in that regard as well. I do think numbers actually lead more to me than words oftentimes, because words can be twisted, but numbers, it's quite exactly that, a number.
Well, I've encountered my fair of silver-tongued devils in journalism and publishing and law. So yeah, I know what you're saying. I also know that certainly for many of the people I knew, again, this is a generalization because there were a lot of engineers in law school as well on the IP track, but we had no shortage of people who went to law school, again, liberal arts backgrounds, who wanted to avoid math.
Yeah.
And then you start having people who freak out when they decide to add federal income tax questions to the bar exam or the essay portion. And then for the first time in a long time, they have to do some math.
Yeah, I think, again, it's self-imposed limits, right? So oftentimes people have these self-imposed limits, right? I mean, really, numbers is not that hard, right? You just have to go like, I can do numbers. And then and that's what I said with statistics. That's purely numbers, except you need to add logic to it. And the logic is what the lawyers tend to have.
Except I did better at finite math than statistics. So the teacher said, then maybe you're better at math than you think you are, because for most people, it's the other way around. They do worse in finite math than in statistics.
Interesting. Well, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, no way to figure that. So the legal profession and compliance writ large have traditionally been male strongholds. That is changing. It's changed certainly since I started covering this beat. But I don't know what you've noticed, the challenges you've experienced as a woman in the profession, and the progress and the opportunities you've seen that have opened up over the course of your career. Could you comment on that for the sake of our students?
Yeah. So first of all, I never really thought about my gender. I'm born with it, so I'm not, again, it's a self-imposed limit, so I'm not going to make it a self-imposed limit, is what I'm saying. So I never made it a self-imposed limit. I would say, though, that I did probably get my first job because they thought Bénédicte was a guy. Yeah, and when Bénédicte showed up as a woman, it was like, probably it was in the US, so they went like, can't discriminate now because we have a woman Bénédicte in front of us. So in some, I probably probably really did get my first job because they thought I was a guy by name, and they selected me. At the time, there was no discrimination protections. I'm pretty sure they selected me because they thought I was a man. But, I was lucky enough as well that it was America, which means the moment I sat in front of them, they know they can't discriminate. So I did get selected. I never really personally experienced the feeling of extreme discrimination against gender, other than, and it wasn't really discrimination, it was a lack of understanding of how difficult it is for women to be pregnant at work. So I was already managing director, so to be pregnant and having to do managing director level job is just really quite hard. And not just the pregnancy itself, you can be lucky. Actually, I was fairly lucky. I didn't get sick. But the problem is after it, your body is just not the same for quite some months. You can hope it is, but it really isn't. And I think that is the fundamental barrier for women. So I don't think it's in most developed world, right? I'm talking a non-discriminatory developed world. There, the barrier is not between the gender itself, because in that sense we're equal. But where the lack of equality comes is in terms of the childbearing, because that only the female body can actually do it, right?
And Europe is not America in this regard.
It doesn't matter. I think the whole of the world is the same in that regard.
Isn't Europe more generous with the time, though?
Oh yeah, maybe you're right. So for me, obviously, I was in Hong Kong, but I think it's more than that. And then comes also the role of women, and it's a little bit changing. But so in some long introduction, but why do I think that lawyers have struggled as women? It's because of that. It's not because they were born woman and another one was man. It's because they decided to get children. And getting children in a very high pressure career, whether it was my managing director level or whether it is a partner level in a law firm, is just really hard, because you do need to continue performing as if you're not pregnant, and as if you haven't delivered a child, and as if you don't have a child you're maybe breastfeeding. I decided not to breastfeed, but anyway, to make my life simple there. But some women feel strongly about this. All of these things make your life actually much harder than your equivalent man doing the same job at that same moment of time, at that same rank. So do I think this is changing? You'd need to ask maybe women in law firms more than me, because I have navigated around it by doing the horizontal career that I told you, by going in-house and by going to the regulator. I've navigated around that period of my life, right, to keep my career going while being able to perform at the level required. For law firms, I think it has been a huge issue. And that's why so many law firms are heavily male dominated. But I do have a feeling that in the last 10 years, it's been gradually changing, because I see quite some successful female lawyers at the partner level. And I think the last 3 years have completely changed it, because now a lot of people are working much more flexibly remotely. And I would say the legal profession is a great one in that regard, because, as I said, once you are at that senior level, whether you're senior associate or partner, you're highly specialized in a field, right? And it doesn't matter, frankly, whether you're sitting with your computer here, or you're sitting with your computer at home, or you're sitting with your computer even on vacation. Your expertise is so specific that it doesn't matter where you're sitting. And so before COVID, we were all in the environment of you must be in the office to be relevant. That environment is gone, and hopefully, luckily so for women, and specifically women who are trying to get over that threshold of child bearing, Because if you can save those 2 extra hours of commute, that 1 extra hour of in-office networking, that's 3 hours saved that you can actually spend on your child, and that gets you through that difficult period. So what is the difficult period? The difficult period for 1 child is at least the first 4 years. For 2 children, the first 6 years. For 3 children, I'd say 9 years. So just keep going, right? The more children, the more long that difficult period of a woman's career is.
I've never had the pleasure, so.
So yeah, so for me, it was 6 years because I had 2 of them, right? And beyond that, it's fine, Once they are 6 and the little one is 3, because this is how it goes, right? If 6 years, I mean, the little one is still only 3, still very small, but you start surviving it. But to think you're at the same, to think man and woman are equal in those first 3 years are of any baby, it's just not true. So I think the inequality is not in some indiscrimination. You see what I'm saying? The inequality is in that physical difference that is just going to be there forever. Yeah. And so the easiest way to work around this, what I'm saying is now, is to hopefully that this remote working sets in as a continued acceptable practice. And then if so, I think women really stand a really good chance with all those other things I've mentioned, which is we have so many protections already, including, by the way, discrimination rules are protections. But secondly, also the fact that in developed markets, we are treated quite equal as far as I'm concerned.
I think that certainly the more enlightened firms are open to more flexible working arrangements. And frankly, right now, the emphasis is on talent and not wanting to lose it. Yeah. And in that regard, a number of firms I know, anecdotally, I can't generalize too much, but from what I've seen, they are willing to work with certain female attorneys who choose to take time off to have kids. And it's to society's benefit. I don't think the overall society of Hong Kong, for example, is as enlightened as the firms in question. I don't know about Singapore, but certainly, yeah, the more people can work from home, I think the more productive they can be. Yeah, they've shown.
I would premise, though, that I do think the first few years of your career is to build that deep expertise that you then literally, where, as I said, it doesn't matter actually where you're sitting. To build that deep expertise, I do think office life is very important. Unless you are completely in another branch, like, for example, if I do design of published reports, then I don't think an office environment is maybe so important. But for lawyers, I think the first years of work,
for the mentorship, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think it's really important. But I'm saying, let's say in my case, I on purpose decided therefore to get my children later, so I got them around 35, then by then I had very much established my fundamental expertise, knowledge, my range of expertise within a company, right? So if at that point there was this allowance that we now have post-COVID, it would have been a lot better, I think. So, and maybe to give you how far we've come, I mean, around that time, which is now around 15 years ago, around that time, I had 2 women who both had delivered children, and they did a job share. And we thought this was so innovative, we did a job share. But if you think about it, it was not innovative because they were each expected to be in the office 2.5 days a week. Why did we expect that in the first place? Because they did a job share because they wanted 2.5 days off. We could have been flexible from day one, right? You see what? Yeah. Anyway, it was innovative at the time, but now it would take the form of work from home, as long as you have the expertise and as long as you're properly doing your job and progressing your work.
Well, they are so keen to not let go of certain female talent that in some cases they're almost creating positions for like knowledge lawyer type roles,
I never heard
which
of this.
basically they work with marketing.
I see.
The focus is producing, well, managing and curating all the white papers and thought leadership pieces that the law firm puts out,
I
and
see.
other such literature and materials. But those are terrific. They can be done from home. You don't have the perennial pressure of billable hours, and for women that are transitioning back into the profession or want to leave, they don't want the high pressure cooker environment, but they still want to do something, but they want to raise their kids. Those types of roles.
Yeah. So you just mentioned the keyword billable hours. Okay.
Yeah.
So that in the legal profession is a reason why many, I think, women fall out, but they don't fall out of the workforce, so it's okay. No. The reason why people would go in-house is because of the billable hours, because that is very difficult to combine with what I just said, a little baby. It's very hard. But you just mentioned earlier Ursula. She's one who really successfully combines this. So maybe you want to ask her those questions, because she's a partner, and B, she has several children. Yeah. More than me, but I forgot how many. But she certainly is more than me.
It's a juggling act.
So look, so there are role models around, right? And I do see some senior partners in other law firms as well, each who have raised children. Maybe the turn came in that's what I'm saying. I think the turn came in the last 5 to 10 years. I went in-house over 20 years ago, so I never could benefit from that turn. But the reason I went in-house is because I probably more than 10 years in advance saw how difficult it would be once you reach that stage. So I rather navigated around all this stuff.
No, and skillfully. I would. It's quite a career you've had. I mean, you've done regulatory affairs as well, and so in terms of in terms of convenience of work and being flexible about that, the legal profession has been slow to change. I mean, I can think of some magic circle firms, and I won't name names, certain blue blood white shoe firms that we call them in the States, that once things normalized, relatively speaking, after COVID, they said, no, we want you back in the office, or at least 3 days a week. I mean, and it's a transition that a lot of people are like, no, I'd rather work less and have a higher quality of life. But Hong Kong doesn't seem too enlightened in that regard.
Well, Hong Kong is, maybe you could say, not that enlightened, but it's also the inverse. Is because Hong Kong is so small, actually it still pays off going to the office. So honestly, I'm back most days, because even though I provided to everybody that option, right, to work from home for at least several days a week, I still like working in an office environment. I feel more motivated in it. I feel like I have more interaction with people who are trying to do the same thing as I, So I do enjoy the office environment, and being so small, Hong Kong is so small, I think more people go to the office. So now think about the US. There's so many people who left New York and then they went sit in much more nicer and cheaper area. They don't want to go back to New York. So US has a huge, well, even in Hong Kong, I take the commute, but I think in the US now with COVID, they spread out even more than the normal commute. Let's put it like that. So I see that pressure. On the three days in the office, personally, I think it's reasonable. And the reason it's reasonable, it's because this is more a managerial point, right? But you always have people who perform better than others, right? And sometimes the high performers, to be honest, they can be wherever. It doesn't matter. They're still going to be working 12-hour days. But the low performers, they will be working very low hours unless they're put back in the office environment. So I hate to say it, but I hate to say it, but the reason why the three days in the office makes sense is because you don't give the opportunity to some people who will actually end up doing very little work.
Or moonlighting.
Yes.
We had cases of that.
So I think it's a bad thing to have to express, but as a manager, you do need to think about the whole group, and so. So I think the 3 days in the office actually does make sense. And keep in mind what an improvement that already is. I said my whole career has been 5 days in the office, right? And 2 days are your weekend. 3 days in the office, that's actually 4 days at home. I mean, that's already more than 50%. So, of course, I can imagine people are wanting 100%, but then you need to really find a job where that company and that boss is completely happy with it.
Every organization is going to have its own culture.
Yeah.
And I mean, Elon Musk has said it's already known, the quote that's basically immortalized by this point, either report back into the office or pretend to work elsewhere.
Yeah, I think the banks in the US have also said, and I agree. I mean, it's not nice to say, but it's the truth, so you have to say it. They say, look, I'm paying you New York salaries, and you're going to sit X hours away at X fraction of the cost. That's fine, but then take the lower pay. You can't. Yeah. Exactly. Let's face it. In hubs, right? Again, London, Hong Kong, Singapore, New York. Why did we come here? We came here because we're paid higher, right? I mean, that's not the sole reason, but it's one of the reasons, right? So, and that is because the cost of living where people congregate is actually higher. It's a demand and supply issue in economics, you could say, right? So I can understand some of those bank bosses who've to others may seem rude, but I can understand that they expressed that and said, okay, look, we're paying you New York pay, so you have to be in New York.
Yeah, I mean, the attitude of a lot of people is, can I continue to rake in my San Francisco Bay Area salary while working from, say, Vegas, which has no state income, Nevada has no state income tax. So that's what they want.
I didn't even know that.
And again, the reasoning is, okay, fine, but then your recompense has to be adjusted for your locale. That's only fair, right? Because otherwise, you've had cases where you had pre-existing employees for the same company in that jurisdiction doing the same job, and this guy who's just moved from LA, who's just moved from San Diego or San Francisco to that jurisdiction, but he's still commanding his or her salary from the higher cost jurisdiction. And when people in the local or the small town office find out about that, there's resentment.
Yeah. I completely agree. So you're right. So people want their cake and eat it. And in life, maybe that's the message for students. You can't have your cake and eat it, right? You can try and improve the nature of your cake or the size of your cake or the flavor of your cake, but you really can't have everything your way, right? So you need to, and let's face it, if you're an employee, you are employed, which means you have decided that you rather have a salary than be a businessman and fend for yourself, right? So in that case, as an employee, you do have to respect the rules of your employer. That's the way I look at that. And I think sometimes, that's because I'm raised like this, but that work ethic is actually quite important, for the success of the employer. And I think that's where the point comes of those senior people who are daring to speak up. They know that the success of the overall entity that employee is part of is dependent on certain factors and certain behaviors.
Well, to quote Diane von Furstenberg, everything you do is in the service of the brand.
Exactly.
So, reasoning by analogy, everything you do is in the service of your employer. You're there to serve them. But the other thing people forget, and this is dangerously so the case, that if work can be done off-site, it can be done off-site in another jurisdiction that's cheaper.
Yes, yes. It's a very good point. So I was thinking as we were just speaking, I mean,
there are a lot of Indians with U.S. LLMs and tax. I mean, they've gone back for whatever reason. They couldn't get a job.
Yeah, I think that's just something people should realize, indeed. So that's my view as well. So one of the reasons I continue setting the trend of coming to the office, because if you take the view that everything can be done from everywhere else, then why even are we still a hub, right?
Well, why are we in business? I mean, why even maintain office? And you as the boss, I mean, you set the tone.
Exactly. Yeah, so that's why I do go to the office, because I don't think I should be imposing rules on others that I'm not doing myself. So I do go to the office to set that standard. Not every day, right? Since COVID is a bit more flexible, I think that's good. But I do go I normally go 4 days a week, really.
But I can tell you, as a freelancer, and certainly this kicked into high gear because of COVID, clients you knew for years didn't want to meet for lunch anymore, didn't want to meet for coffee. They give you your instructions and your assignments over the phone, via email. The life of a freelancer is already quite lonely. And that turned it up a notch ratcheted up several levels because of COVID. And I can tell you, working from home, it damages people's health for the most part, for many people. I saw this with myself. It's deleterious to your health, and quite frankly, I've seen this in a few cases. It's horrible for psychological health.
Yeah,
and it's the learners that go off the deep end because they've got no one to refer to.
I completely agree, and so this is what I'm saying. I said I go to the office because I enjoy communicating with other people. And
no one's an island. Yeah, no one's an island.
I enjoy communicating about the topics that are part of my profession or what I do those days. So those people doing the same thing is how I described it, right? So if I go sit even in a cafe in Discovery Bay, I live in a beautiful area in Discovery Bay. If I go sit in that cafe, I'm only typing these thoughts. I'm never speaking these thoughts. And there's many studies on Earth about health and longevity in particular. Do you know that one of the core things that people are tying to longevity is the number of your social interactions? And it can be as basic as me going to 7-Eleven, picking up this Bon Aqua and saying hello to the lady behind the counter and having a chat about whether Bon Aqua is better or let's say Evian is better. It doesn't need to be between friends. It doesn't need to be in highly engaged. But that minimum amount of human engagement is apparently a very key to longevity. And I've been thinking, for example, Hong Kong is a very strange place, right? Because we do have enormous pollution, yet we have one of the highest longevity in the world. I think it's that. I think it is because people interact, because they do go to mahjong shops, they do go eat dim sum. I'm serious.
Plus the homes are too small to entertain too. That is.
So in sum, I think we should not ignore the value. Maybe to conclude, we shouldn't ignore the value of the office. I think it has a very high value intellectually in terms of stimulation, and that high intellectual stimulation actually also goes paired incidentally with good health, as you said. I just yesterday had a gala dinner for one of the charities that we work, Women in Finance, by the way, for all the ladies who may listen. So in sum, we did our gala dinner yesterday. We raise money all the time for local causes that support women in the community, sometimes broader than women as well. But for example, we just did a fitness challenge with a charity called Run that supports refugees in Hong Kong to get over post-traumatic syndrome and things like this. And one of the people at the table had been working from home for a very long time because she actually lives in Sheko now, which is quite far, right? And she's really enjoying it there. But she tells me, I feel like I've become so asocial. Yeah, like that's what she said, because she feels like she's not so comfortable in big groups of people now.
People
And
can regress without that
yeah,
interpersonal contact.
and it's really odd thing, right? So that's something I have no doubt on stimulation, intellectual stimulation. I have no doubt on the value of human interaction, even to happiness. But now I'm thinking about this last thing, is when you're really alone, whether your social skills drop. And if that's the case, then you should put yourself in social context, because for every job, and certainly a law job, you do need very, very strong interhuman communication skills.
I've seen lawyers that have been successful, that have been specialist niche types, that have been loners. Guy in the corner, leave him alone. But
that's the rare
you call them when they need to. But the ones that thrive, the ones that make partner, the ones that people want to be around, the ones that become people in the community, have the strong social skills, leadership skills, the gravitas. And I don't know, that's not, I mean, if you're an introvert, I mean, it almost seems like then being an introvert is the cardinal sin in this profession. And
look, I hate to say it, but I think even when I'm now hiring technology people, right, and I'm actually doing interviews right now, all of them that I interviewed had a slide on personal skills. So all of them have been taught already that if you really want to function in organizations, you can't just be the loner in the corner. So it doesn't just apply to law. In some, as you say, there can be very successful people who are loners, so I do not want to exclude that. But that's not the case for the average person. And after all, we all have to think about ourselves as an average. Our chances are that we're only an average, which means we need to at least adopt the average behaviors. And the average behaviors are to fit into a group of people. Yeah. And so I said, I think, but for lawyers specifically, I would say when I think about hiring lawyers, then I think about hiring them because of the strength of their communication skill. Whereas if I'm hiring a coder, I'm actually hiring him for the strength of his coding skill, but I also need communication skill.
Because you have to interact with them.
Not just that, but also what I noticed is the real alpha actually on technology people is that they can explain what they're doing in simple layman terms that you and me as lawyers can understand. And so that is a very rare type of computer science guy. The computer science guy who wants to communicate, already not, that's already a subsection of them, rather than be rather lonely with the computer. But on top of it, whose communication clarity allows him or her to explain very difficult concepts to anybody else around them, lawyers or laymen in general, that is a very rare subtype.
That is where it goes back to the problem of some people know the subject matter but can't teach it.
Yes. Yeah, so it's the same for professors, right? So see the trend here? The trend is you have to be able to communicate. Yeah. And to be able to communicate, you need to fit in the society. And in the case of your employee and employer relationship, that's your job.
Oh, totally. I've learned securities regulation from an investment banker to a lawyer. I've learned it from an academic who's been a law professor for God knows how many years. Very different approaches, very different communication styles. And I have to say the investment banker, I learned more with the investment banker when he was teaching securities regulation, and later investment banker when he was covering the same cases in an advanced setting. I learned more from him because he was covering things in a practical way and said, okay, there are 20 concepts we want you to retain from this basic securities regulation course.
Because that's true, because they have thought through the course and they remember those 100 pages and know only 20 are the ones that recur every day.
Totally. I mean, whereas with the academic, it was, here's this material and I expect you to have mastery of all of it for the final exam. And they're testing esoteric things like green mail, which so rarely comes up. But I will say that there's something to be said for learning it from a practitioner, and there's something to be said for academic law, and I think both types of learning are important. Anyway, as we near the end of our time, is there anything you'd like to say, anything you'd like to share, anything you'd like to impress upon our viewers and listeners, particularly our students?
No, so as I said, I think law is a very valuable, let's say, field to choose and career to choose. I think for everybody, though, even with that general degree, you have to decide which direction you go into, right? And law offers many choices anyway, but I do think, as I said at the beginning, if you really want to be a successful partner in a law firm, you have to specialize. You have to pick that one field that you like and that you're willing to commit to nearly for the rest of your life. If that's not you, then you can go for my type of route, which is an internal in-house career of quite high diversity. My one is really, really diverse, I'd say. But in some, your basic skill set that you learn in a law degree is useful to all of these paths. But again, as concluded just now, make sure your communication skills and your human interaction skills are what you personally emphasize, because ultimately that's what makes any professional successful, whether it's a lawyer or a sales guy or a doctor or, as I said, a computer scientist. The ones who are most successful normally are the ones who are able to express what they're doing the best for their profession. So, and then finally on this debate of home versus office work, as said, as a junior lawyer, as a starting lawyer, do not set the standard as the work from home the whole week, because you will learn much less fast. And maybe the one thing we didn't touch upon, but networks. Life is all about networks. As you said, in COVID, people didn't want to have lunch, but now my lunch schedule is continuously busy. And I said to my junior staff, look, you may think like she's out for lunch for 2 hours, right? Yes, she's out for lunch.
But she's working her relationships.
Not only that, but where is she getting the new ideas? Where is she knowing what's really happening in the market? Is it by sitting with the 5 people that she knows? Or is it by listening to the hundreds of people out there doing hundreds of different jobs in hundreds of different fields? So for example, blockchain. I learn most now from all the time listening to the network I've built from being in that sector. So networking is critically important, and to go back to an office context for junior lawyers, networking with the senior partners is what's going to get you on the track you want to be on.
Certainly I've noticed, not just in this profession, but in certainly financial services, certainly investment banking, the people with the widest circles seem to do the best. And going back to my point about, I don't know if this, maybe I'm overstating the case by saying being an introvert is the cardinal sin, but being an extrovert is most certainly the cardinal virtue.
Yes, I think that's right. Yeah. And look, I would even classify myself as between an extrovert and an introvert. So my natural inclination is to actually be very happy sitting in a corner doing something. Very happy, right? So I force myself to do all that other stuff because I know this is, if you want to be successful, you're going to have to communicate. If you want to be successful, you're going to have to network. If you're going to be successful, you have to, while you network, treat people well so that you are the go-to person for them, and your network becomes, as you say, a virtuous, continuous circle. So, again, sitting in the corner is particularly pleasant, and it's safe. But it's not what's going to make you particularly successful, as certainly not as a beginning career person. That's my view.
Certainly, that's what I've told to young graduates seeking to go into journalism, that if you do not, one journalist said to me, and he learned this lesson too late, but he did relatively okay, but he said, not joining the FCC, the Foreign Correspondents Club, sooner delayed the progress of my career by 10 years.
Wow.
Because there is there's a certain cadre of freelance writers in this town that have the inside track on the plum juiciest assignments. And many of those relationships, many of those contacts get made at the FCC. And it's a small investment, but I said to them, it's a small investment in your career. And it isn't just about work. Friendships get built there, and contacts get built there. You never know.
And new opportunities. You get opportunities from that network. I bet you in journalism,
to grow, to learn,
topics you would suddenly that are becoming prevalent topics, right? So maybe to go back to the FT program I just did, we were given an annual report to study, right? And study from all perspectives, corporate governance, ESG, but also the numbers. And so on the corporate governance side, our annual report, which I will leave unnamed, but it had like all these, property tycoons, one after the other being a director on the board, right? And I went like, okay, we had to judge, is that a bad thing or a good thing? And you go like, well, this is hard to say,
because Hong Kong's so incestuous.
Yes, but it could be a bad thing from some perspectives. Let's say in this case, there was no female diversity. So that was obviously something was lacking there. But the good thing is they create the virtuous network amongst themselves, right? They know information faster by interacting. So that's what anybody just needs to understand. Your whole life ultimately is about the network you build around you. And that network is going to be your information source, as you say, which is useful for your profession, whatever the profession is. But secondly, it's also going to be you rise with that network. And if you have no network, you're in no boat jointly rising. You're in your own little rowing boat, rowing on your own. So I think it's very critically important to think about the value of networks. And so in that case, I found it very hard to say, look, they didn't have female diversity, that was obvious. They didn't have sufficient actually diversity of background, as in no lawyer, for example, on that board. They had an accountant, but all the others were the same type of business people. But to go as far as to say, well, they shouldn't be there, is to me a completely different question, because they can advise each other much quicker than any outsider on what the next threat or the next opportunity is.
To your point about networks, as one of my mentors told me a long time ago, there are certain people, there are certain individuals in the legal profession, he was saying that by virtue of the circles they run in, their earnings potential and their rise in society it's on a different trajectory, again, by virtue of the circles they have. So again, Bénédicte, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. That's my pleasure.
Enjoyed it. And thank you all for joining us. Please tune in again. Until next time.